The room at Buckingham Palace had been prepared for a routine meeting. Then King Charles closed the door, looked directly at Prince William and Catherine, and said something that neither of them expected to hear. "From this moment on, you will have to carry more of the crown than I ever wanted you to." For several seconds, nobody spoke. A sealed document lay on the table. William stared at it. Catherine noticed that Princess Anne was unusually serious. And then Charles revealed the reason for the meeting. He was stepping back from a major part of his public responsibilities. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The real shock was what Charles had decided about who would control the monarchy while he stepped away. And when William opened the document, one name appeared again and again: Camilla. What happened next would turn a difficult royal transition into a battle over influence, loyalty, and the future direction of the crown. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this royal story takes an unexpected turn before the final decision is made. For months, Charles had been trying to keep everything looking normal. The public saw official engagements. They saw ceremonies. They saw meetings and carefully planned appearances. But inside the palace, the schedule had slowly begun to change. Some engagements were shortened. Some meetings were transferred to William. And increasingly, Catherine was being asked to represent the royal family at events that would once have received the king's personal attention. Nobody wanted to say what those changes meant. Not publicly, because Charles was still king, and William was still the heir. But behind closed doors, one question had become impossible to avoid. What would happen if Charles could no longer carry the same workload? Charles knew the answer couldn't simply be to ask William to do more whenever something became difficult. There needed to be a clear structure. There needed to be defined responsibilities. And most importantly, there needed to be no confusion about who had the final authority. That was why William and Catherine were sitting across from him now. Charles opened the first folder. "This is not an abdication," he said. William immediately looked up. Charles continued, "I remain king, but I need to reduce some of my public responsibilities." William listened carefully. Charles explained that he wanted William to take a greater role in important state matters, senior meetings, and long-term planning. Catherine would also receive expanded responsibilities involving ceremonial occasions, diplomatic receptions, and major public engagements. It was a significant change, but it was not yet a crisis. Then William turned another page. His expression changed. There was a section concerning the Queen's household. He looked at Charles. "Why is Camilla's office included here?" Before Charles could answer, Princess Anne pushed a second folder across the table. "This," she said quietly, "is the problem." William opened it. The papers described proposals for Camilla's household to remain involved in certain royal decisions during Charles's reduced schedule. The language was respectful. It talked about experience, continuity, tradition, and the king's interests. But beneath the polite wording was a much bigger issue. Camilla's household wanted to maintain a significant voice in decisions that would increasingly fall under William's responsibility. William looked toward Charles. "Did you approve this?" Charles stared at the papers. "No." The room became silent. Charles wasn't angry because Camilla had wanted to remain useful. He understood why she would. What concerned him was the possibility of creating two separate centers of influence, one surrounding William and another surrounding Camilla. If that happened, every disagreement could eventually return to Charles. and that would defeat the entire purpose of reducing his workload. William finally spoke. "If I accept these responsibilities, I need to know that they're actually mine." Charles looked at his son. "They will be." Camilla was invited to the meeting later that afternoon. When she entered the room, she immediately understood that something serious had happened. The folders were still on the table. She looked at Charles, then William, then Catherine. Charles did not accuse her. Instead, he asked whether her household had been preparing for a greater role during his reduced schedule. Camilla admitted that discussions had taken place, but she insisted there had been no attempt to challenge William. She explained that she had spent years working beside Charles. She understood the ceremonial system. She knew how royal engagements were organized, and she believed her experience could help the monarchy through a difficult transition. William didn't dismiss her argument. In fact, he understood it. But he also saw the danger. Camilla proposed a compromise. William could handle state and strategic responsibilities. Catherine could take on additional public duties. But Camilla's household would remain consulted on major ceremonial decisions and matters involving the king's interests. For a moment, nobody objected. Then Catherine asked a simple question. "If William and Camilla disagree, who has the final word?" Camilla paused. She answered carefully. "The king's wishes should guide the matter." William looked at Charles. That was precisely the problem. Charles was stepping back because he needed fewer decisions coming directly to him. If every disagreement still required his intervention, then he wasn't really stepping back. He was simply moving the workload behind closed doors. Charles looked at Camilla. "I don't want to leave you out," he said. "But I also cannot create a system where every decision has two authorities." Camilla's expression hardened slightly. "I have never asked to replace William." Charles nodded. "I know. But you must understand," he continued, "that supporting the crown and directing its future are not always the same thing." The room fell silent. For the first time, Camilla realized that this wasn't about whether Charles valued her. It was about where the monarchy was heading. Later that evening, William and Catherine spoke privately. William was worried about how the public would interpret everything. "If I take too much responsibility, they'll say I'm pushing my father aside." Catherine nodded. "And if you refuse it, they'll say the monarchy isn't prepared for the future." William looked frustrated. "There is no perfect answer." Catherine's thought for a moment. "Then don't make it about power." William looked at her. "Make it about responsibility." That sentence changed the way he approached the situation. The question wasn't whether William should have more influence than Camilla. The question was whether every responsibility should have a clearly defined owner. Catherine understood that the public would be watching. Every photograph would be analyzed. Every absence would become a rumor. Every disagreement would become a headline. So the transition needed to look organized, not personal. William agreed. The palace advisors began rewriting the proposal. Camilla's official role would remain intact. Her public duties would continue. Her relationship with Charles would remain respected. But her household would not have the authority to override responsibilities assigned to William. Catherine's expanded role would also be clearly defined. Charles would remain king. William would remain heir. But William would now carry a greater portion of the public and institutional workload. The arrangement was finally beginning to make sense. Then Charles reached the final page. He read it carefully. William expected him to sign. Instead, Charles picked up a pen. He added one sentence. Nobody spoke. Charles placed the pen down. William leaned forward. The new line made the entire arrangement unmistakable. Responsibilities formally assigned by the Crown cannot be overridden by another royal household. William read it twice. Catherine looked at Charles. Anne remained silent. Charles wasn't humiliating Camilla. He was preventing future confusion. If William was responsible for something, he had to be able to act. If Catherine was assigned a duty, another office couldn't quietly redirect it. And if Charles reduced his workload, he couldn't be forced to settle every disagreement. Charles signed the document. Anne signed as witness. William acknowledged the arrangement. The document was sealed. Charles then looked at William. "I would rather make one difficult decision today," he said, "than leave you with 10 unresolved battles tomorrow." William nodded. He finally understood. His father wasn't giving him the crown. He was giving him responsibility. Camilla received the document that evening. She read it slowly. Her title remained unchanged. Her position beside Charles remained unchanged. Her public work remained unchanged. But one thing was now different. Her household could no longer treat William's responsibilities as something open to negotiation. She asked whether the wording could be changed. The answer was no. Charles had signed it personally. Camilla sat quietly for several moments. She could challenge the decision. She could make the disagreement public. Or she could accept that Charles had drawn a boundary he believed was necessary. She chose neither immediately. Instead, she asked to speak to Charles privately. The meeting took place later that night. There were no advisors, no cameras, no staff, just Charles and Camilla. Camilla looked at him. "I understand why you're doing this." Charles said nothing. "But I don't want people to think I've been pushed out." "You haven't," Charles replied. "Then what am I supposed to do?" Charles answered honestly. "Continue the work you've always done." Camilla looked surprised. "You still want me beside you?" "Of course. Even after this." Charles nodded. "This isn't about removing you from my life." He paused. "It is about making sure William can do his job without constantly looking over his shoulder." Camilla looked down. For years, she had supported Charles through difficult periods. She had earned a place beside him. But perhaps she had allowed that closeness to become too closely connected to the machinery of government. She finally asked, "And what happens to my household?" Charles replied, "It remains your household, but it doesn't become another command center." Camilla was quiet. Then she nodded. "I can accept that." Charles looked relieved. But Camilla wasn't finished. "I want one thing in return." Charles raised an eyebrow. "I want William to understand that I am not his enemy." Charles smiled faintly. "I think he already does." The next morning, William was told about the conversation. He wasn't completely convinced that everything had been solved. But Catherine reminded him that the purpose of the new arrangement was never to defeat Camilla. It was to create clarity. William agreed. He asked to meet Camilla. The meeting was private. There were no dramatic accusations, no raised voices. William simply told her, "I don't want this to become a family war." Camilla looked at him. "Neither do I." William continued, "You have experience that I don't. Camilla nodded. "And you have responsibilities that I cannot take away," she replied. William extended his hand. "But my responsibilities need to remain mine." Camilla took his hand. "Then let's make sure they do." It was a small moment, but it changed everything. Meanwhile, the palace prepared the official announcement. The public knew that Charles would make an important statement. They did not yet know exactly what he would say. Outside Buckingham Palace, cameras gathered. Inside, Charles prepared himself. William and Catherine stood nearby. Before the doors opened, Charles looked at William. "This isn't the end of my reign." William nodded. "I know." Charles smiled. "But it is the moment when I stop pretending I can do everything forever." William placed a hand on his father's shoulder. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, only understanding. Then the doors opened. Charles walked toward the cameras. The announcement began. He spoke about duty, about continuity, about the importance of protecting the monarchy for the future. Then he confirmed that he would reduce a significant part of his public schedule. But he made one thing absolutely clear. He was not abdicating. William was not becoming king. The crown had not changed hands. Instead, William would assume greater responsibility for important state and institutional matters. Then Charles spoke about Catherine. Her expanded responsibilities would include major ceremonial occasions, diplomatic events, and a broader public role. The message was unmistakable. The next generation was being asked to carry more. But Charles remained firmly at the center of the institution. Camilla watched the announcement from a private room. When William's new responsibilities were announced, she remained silent. When Catherine's role was described, she looked toward the signed document beside her. There had been no public attack, no humiliation, no accusation against her. But the structure had changed. William now had clearly defined authority. And Camilla understood that this was permanent. For a moment, tears filled her eyes. Not because she had lost her place. She hadn't. But because she realized that the role she had imagined for herself during Charles's reduced schedule would never exist in quite the way she had expected. Charles had chosen the future structure of the monarchy, and that future belonged increasingly to William and Catherine. Camilla wiped away a tear. Then she made a decision. She would not fight it. She would support Charles. She would continue her public work. And she would respect William's responsibilities. That evening, the four of them met again. Charles looked at William. William looked at Camilla. Catherine stood beside them. Charles said, "This is what I wanted from the beginning." William asked what he meant. "A monarchy where everyone knows what they are responsible for." Camilla smiled faintly. "And where nobody has to wonder who is giving the orders." Charles laughed quietly. For the first time in weeks, the tension in the room disappeared. There was no dramatic victory. No one had been defeated. But a difficult boundary had finally been established. Charles would remain king. William would carry more responsibility. Catherine would play a larger role. And Camilla would remain an important part of the royal family without creating a competing center of authority. The crisis was over. In the weeks that followed, the new arrangement became visible. William began taking on more state responsibilities. Catherine appeared at major diplomatic and ceremonial events. Charles reduced parts of his schedule while continuing to carry out the duties he retained. And Camilla continued her public work, now with a clearer understanding of where her role ended. There were still disagreements. There always would be. But the palace no longer had to wonder who had the final responsibility. The uncertainty had disappeared. And that was perhaps the most important result of all. Charles had not stepped away from the crown. He had stepped back from trying to carry everything himself. William had not taken his father's place. He had simply begun preparing for the day when that responsibility would eventually become his. Catherine had not claimed a future title before its time. She had accepted the responsibility that came with being William's partner and one of the monarchy's most visible figures. And Camilla had not been pushed aside. She had accepted a different kind of role, one built around support rather than control. As Charles watched William and Catherine leave the room together, he knew something important had changed. Not the crown, not the king, but the way the monarchy would prepare for its future. And sometimes, the biggest royal changes don't happen when a crown is passed from one head to another. They happen when responsibility quietly moves from one generation to the next. If you enjoyed this dramatic royal story, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more royal stories, palace developments, and unforgettable moments from inside the royal family.